Hi everyone. Tonight we're giving up air conditioning, running water, and the comforting hum of a refrigerator for something considerably older and considerably hotter. Ancient Babylon, at the exact moment it decided to become the most impressive city on Earth. Think mud-brick towers instead of skyscrapers, a river doing the work of every highway you've ever sat in traffic on, and a king with an apparent personal mission to build things so enormous that people are still debating, thousands of years later, whether he was showing off or just couldn't help himself. Before we go any further, if these nightly detours into places you'll genuinely never have to pack a suitcase for are doing something for you, a like or a subscribe is always appreciated, though only ever offer one honestly earned. Drop a comment and tell me whereabouts you're tucked in tonight and what the clock says on your end, because it does seem like there's reliably someone, somewhere, still awake at an hour they have no good excuse for. Go ahead now and lower the lights. Get whatever hum or breeze helps you drift, and settle in properly, because where we're headed tonight, nobody ever had to think twice about a power bill. Let's wander together for a second before we land. Have you ever tried to haggle for a jug of beer, using nothing but a pinch of shaved silver and pure confidence? Could you survive a Mesopotamian summer with no fan, no ice, and a mud-brick wall as your only line of defense against a heat that seems to take it personally? Would you trust a priest who reads your entire future in the shape of a sheep's liver? And could you keep your composure while being handed the terms of a defaulted loan, in a city where the penalty might involve handing over an actual member of your household? Well, congratulations. You've just opened your eyes in Babylon, somewhere around 570 BCE, deep in the reign of a king who seems to believe that if you're going to build a capital city, you might as well build the loudest, tallest, most talked about one history has ever produced. Welcome to the center of the known world. Try not to get turned around near the river. Let's start with the moment your eyes open, because Babylon does not believe in a gentle sunrise. The heat arrives before the light really does, seeping through mud-brick walls that have spent all yesterday quietly baking and have clearly decided not to let the memory go. You're stretched out on a woven mat on a flat rooftop, which is exactly where half the city sleeps once summer sets in, since indoors at night here is basically an oven that happens to still contain your family. Somewhere below, a rooster is already regretting its life choices, and the skyline of mud-brick towers is starting to shimmer like it's considering melting out of pure spite. Welcome to morning in the most powerful city on Earth, where the very first task of the day, every single day, is simply outlasting the temperature. You sit up slowly, because sudden movement before the sun has fully committed to ruining your day feels unwise, and you take stock of the rooftop around you. Neighbours are stirring on their own flat roofs a few feet away, separated only by low mud-brick parapets, which means your entire household's private business, including whatever your uncle mutters in his sleep, has technically been shared with the block all night. There's no real privacy up here, only the polite fiction that nobody's listening. You can hear someone below sweeping a courtyard, the scrape of a broom against packed earth, and further off the low creak of a well being worked, one bucket at a time, by someone considerably more awake than you currently are. The air itself has a weight to it this early, thick and warm, and carrying the mineral tang of river silt, mixed faintly with wood smoke from the first cooking fires being coaxed to life.
You run a hand along the rooftop parapet, and it's already warm to the touch, which tells you everything you need to know about where the day is headed. Ever tried sleeping on your patio in July because the bedroom felt like a sauna, only to wake up and discover the patio had become a slightly larger sauna? Congratulations, Babylonians invented that exact experience roughly 4,000 years before your air conditioner did, and they did it without a single fan. There's a rhythm to how the household wakes that you'll learn quickly enough to follow. Someone fetches water first, since the well or the nearest canal channel doesn't wait politely for you to feel ready. Someone else stirs the coals from the night before back into a usable fire, because starting from nothing every single morning would be its own special kind of misery. Children are nudged awake with considerably less ceremony than you might expect, expected to help before they've had a chance to properly complain about it, which honestly tracks with how mornings go in most households across most of human history. By the time you climb down the ladder or narrow stairway into the house proper, the heat has already started its slow, patient climb, and you understand instinctively that today, like every day, will be organised entirely around managing it. Everything else, the marketplace, the temple, the endless bureaucratic paperwork of an empire, all of it will simply have to happen in the gaps the heat allows. It's less a schedule and more a negotiated truce with the sun, one Babylon renews every single morning, and one it has never actually won. Let's talk about what an entire city smells like when it's built out of river mud, sun-baked brick, and roughly 500,000 people going about their business with absolutely no modern plumbing to speak of. Dust hangs thick and pale in the air, kicked up by donkey carts on streets that are really just packed dirt with delusions of grandeur. Wood smoke curls from breakfast fires. Somewhere a fishmonger is already mid-argument with a customer over freshness, and underneath everything sits the mineral, faintly swampy smell of the Euphrates, the river that built this entire civilization and has never once let anyone forget it. It's loud, it's pungent, and in its own chaotic way, it is unmistakably, gloriously alive. Step further into the street, and the smells start layering on top of each other with real enthusiasm. A baker's stall breathes out the warm, slightly charred scent of flatbread against a hot clay oven wall, while 2 doors down a tanner's workshop contributes something considerably less pleasant, sharp and animal and faintly ammonia-laced, the unavoidable cost of turning hides into anything useful. You learn quickly to breathe through your mouth near the tanners and through your nose everywhere else, a skill every Babylonian child seems to have mastered by around age 6, without anyone formally teaching it. The sound is just as layered as the smell. Cartwheels grind over packed earth. A donkey brays its objection to absolutely everything about its morning. Somewhere a bronzesmith is hammering out a repair, a bright, ringing clang that carries oddly far given the narrow streets. Voices rise and fall in the particular cadence of people haggling before they've even properly woken up, since apparently commerce here waits for no one, least of all the sun. It's the acoustic equivalent of a city that runs entirely on caffeine, except nobody's had any yet, because coffee is roughly 4,000 years away from being anybody's problem. Ever walked into a farmer's market at 7 a.m. and been hit by that wall of fish, flowers and fresh bread all competing for your attention at once? Multiply that by a city with no refrigeration, no sewage system worth the name, and a river doing triple duty as water source, transportation, and unofficial trash removal, and you start to get the picture. It's not always pleasant. It is, however, never boring, which is more than you can say for most modern commutes. Children dart between the stalls, already put to work running errands or minding a younger sibling, weaving around the legs of merchants setting up for the day. A scribe hurries past, clutching a satchel of damp clay tablets, looking the exact way anyone looks when they're late for something bureaucratic and mildly dreaded. And above it all, the mudbrick ziggurat looms in the middle distance, catching the very first proper sunlight of the day, turning briefly gold before settling into its usual dusty tan for the next 12 hours of relentless heat. It's a city assembling itself in real time every single morning, smell by smell, sound by sound, and somehow it never once looks rehearsed. It's time to get dressed, and no, you don't simply throw on whatever's clean, because in Babylon, your appearance announces your standing before you've said a single word. Men wear long fringed woolen garments, wrapped and pinned with real deliberation, and a beard here is never just facial hair, it's a curated, oiled, occasionally elaborately curled statement of dignity that takes genuine daily effort. Jewellery isn't reserved only for the wealthy either. Small cylinder seals hang from wrists and necks, doubling as decoration and as a kind of personal signature, since rolling one across wet clay is how you legally put your name to something. You adjust your fringe, check your seal is secure, and step outside looking, you hope, like someone who reliably pays their debts. The wool itself deserves a moment of appreciation, because wearing heavy fringed fabric in a climate that regularly tries to cook you alive seems, on the surface, like a genuinely terrible decision. And yet, the weave is looser than you'd expect, allowing some air through, and the layers can be adjusted through the day, wrapped tighter in the cool of morning and loosened as the sun does its worst. Women's garments follow a similar principle, long and draped, often belted, with the wealthier households adding dyed borders in reds and blues that took real skill and real expense to produce. Dye, cloth, and cut all quietly tell anyone paying attention exactly which rung of Babylonian society you occupy, long before you've opened your mouth to confirm it. The beard, for men who can manage one, gets genuine daily attention. Oil is worked through it to keep it glossy despite the dust, and for those with the means, a barber shapes and sometimes curls it into neat, ringed sections that would take real patience to maintain. It's less a beard at that point, and more a personal grooming project with ongoing maintenance costs, not unlike the modern obsession with a particular haircut that apparently requires a stylist's visit every 11 days, without fail. Ever known someone who treats their eyebrows with the seriousness of a temple ritual? Babylon would have completely understood. Then there's the seal, the single most practical accessory of the entire outfit. Carved from stone, no bigger than a finger, engraved with tiny, detailed scenes of gods, animals, or ceremonial figures, it rolls across a strip of wet clay to leave a continuous, uniquely identifiable impression, functioning as a signature, a wax seal, and an ID card all rolled into one small cylinder. Lose it, and you've essentially lost your legal identity for the day, unable to properly witness a contract, confirm a delivery, or seal an agreement, which makes losing your house keys feel comparatively low stakes. You step out the door finally, wrapped, oiled, and properly sealed, looking every bit like a person who intends to be taken seriously by merchants, scribes, and the occasional skeptical tax collector. The whole process has taken longer than you expected, longer certainly than rolling out of bed and grabbing whatever's on the chair. But in a city where your fringe pattern and the curl of your beard are doing real social work on your behalf before you've said a word, that extra effort starts to look less like vanity and more like basic professional courtesy. Let's talk about breakfast, which in Babylon almost always starts with beer. And no, this isn't some wild personal indulgence. It's simply how an entire civilization stays hydrated in a climate that would otherwise make the water supply a slow-motion disaster. The beer is thick, cloudy, and full of floating grain sediment, which is exactly why everyone drinks it through a long reed straw rather than tipping the cup back like an animal. Alongside it comes flatbread, a handful of dates so naturally sweet they barely need any help, and cheese if the household happens to be doing well that season. It isn't a large meal. It is, however, a genuinely serious one, because nobody gets through this heat on an empty stomach and good intentions alone. You settle onto a low stool near the courtyard, and someone hands you a shared jar with 2 or 3 reed straws already poking out of it, because breakfast here is very much a communal event rather than a private one. The straw itself is a genuinely clever piece of engineering, filtering out the worst of the floating barley husks and sediment, so you're not chewing your morning drink quite so much as sipping it, though a little grit still makes it through, no matter how carefully you position the straw. The beer is mildly alcoholic, low enough that drinking it steadily through the day doesn't leave you incapable of function, which is precisely the point, since the river water alone carries real risks that this civilization has long since learned to work around. The bread is flat, slightly charred at the edges from the clay oven wall it was slapped against, and still warm enough to steam faintly in the cooler morning air. Dates get pressed into it, or eaten straight off a woven tray, sticky and intensely sweet, grown along the riverbanks in groves that have fed this region for generations longer than anyone can accurately count. If the household has done well this season, a small block of cheese rounds things out, sharp and slightly grainy, made from goat or sheep's milk, and kept in a cool corner of the house for as long as the heat allows, which in practice is not very long at all. Ever grabbed a smoothie and a granola bar on your way out the door, telling yourself that counts as a real breakfast? Babylon essentially invented that same philosophy 4,000 years earlier, minus the smoothie, plus roughly 9% alcohol by volume, and somehow it still counts as responsible parenting. Children get their own smaller portion of the beer too, weaker and more heavily diluted, which would raise several eyebrows in your own kitchen, but here is simply understood as the safest liquid available before noon. Conversation over breakfast tends to be practical rather than leisurely. Quick logistics about the day ahead, who's heading to the market, whether the canal gate needs checking, whether a debt payment is due this week. Nobody lingers long. The meal exists to fuel the morning, not to savour it, and within a short while the courtyard empties out, as everyone scatters toward their particular slice of the day's business.
You drain the last of your reed straw, set the jar down, and step out into a city that has already been awake and working for hours, fully expecting you to catch up. Now it's time to actually go outside, which in Babylon means immediately surrendering any hope of walking in a straight line. The streets twist between windowless mudbrick walls, narrow enough in places that 2 loaded donkeys can't pass without a diplomatic incident, and just wide enough elsewhere for a genuine crowd to gather around absolutely nothing. There are no street signs, no maps worth trusting, and no polite Babylonian equivalent of simply asking your phone. You navigate by landmark instead, by the smell of a particular bakery, by the shadow a particular temple throws at a particular hour. Get it wrong, and you'll circle the same unimpressed goat 3 separate times, which turns out to be a remarkably old and remarkably universal travel experience. The walls themselves are the first thing that throws you off, since Babylonian houses present a blank, windowless face to the street on purpose, all the actual living happening around an interior courtyard hidden from public view. It means every street looks disorienting, close to identical. Mud brick corridor after mud brick corridor, broken only by the occasional low doorway or the particular colour of a threshold someone painted to mark their home. You start to understand fairly quickly why locals rely so heavily on smell and sound rather than sight. That baker on the corner isn't just selling bread, he's also, quite unintentionally, serving as a navigational beacon for half the neighbourhood. Foot traffic moves with a logic all its own. Merchants with baskets balanced on their heads, weaving between slower-moving carts. Children darting through gaps too narrow for anyone taller than they are. The occasional official striding through with the unmistakable posture of someone who expects the crowd to simply part for him, which, more often than not, it does. You press yourself against a wall to let a heavily loaded donkey cart squeeze past, and the owner mutters something under his breath that you're fairly sure isn't a compliment. Ever tried following turn-by-turn directions in an old European city, only to discover the street sign changed names 4 times in 6 blocks for no discernible reason? Babylon runs on that exact energy, except there was never a sign to begin with, and the person giving you directions is fully convinced their explanation was crystal clear. Ask someone for help finding the market, and you'll likely get a description built entirely around landmarks that mean nothing to a newcomer. Past the tanner's stink, before the canal bends, near where old Ninurta Nasir's donkey once bit a tax collector. It's vivid. It's memorable. It's also completely useless if you don't already know the neighbourhood. Eventually, mercifully, the mud brick maze starts to open up as you near the busier parts of the city, streets widening slightly, the crowd thickening, the noise rising into something you can actually follow toward its source. You catch sight of a familiar shape looming above the rooftops ahead, the unmistakable stepped silhouette of the great ziggurat. And for the first time all morning, you have something resembling a fixed point to walk toward. It isn't a map. It isn't even particularly precise. But in a city with no other reliable way to orient yourself, a 4,000-year-old tower turns out to make a remarkably dependable landmark. Let's head to the marketplace. A genuinely overwhelming tangle of stalls, selling everything from Euphrates fish, still twitching in their baskets, to imported lapis lazuli, hauled down from mountains you will never personally see. Merchants shout over one another, scales click and clatter, and every transaction, however small,
comes bundled with an expected round of theatrical bargaining. Paying the first asking price isn't just unusual here, it's practically an insult, a quiet accusation that you don't understand how business is done. So, you learn to sigh dramatically, to feign walking away, to act personally wounded by the price of a sack of onions, all while the merchant performs the exact same routine right back at you. It's part sport, part social ritual, and thoroughly exhausting before you've bought a single thing. The stalls themselves sprawl out in loose, chaotic rows that seem to follow no organizing principle whatsoever, though locals clearly know exactly which corner sells the best barley, and which one to avoid entirely after a bad batch of dates ruined someone's reputation last season.
Baskets of onions and garlic sit beside pyramids of dates, beside a table of gleaming bronze tools, beside a woman selling small clay figurines meant to ward off household misfortune, because apparently even a trip to buy vegetables comes with the option of hedging your spiritual bets at the same time. The sound is a constant layered roar, merchants calling out prices and qualities in competing volumes, a bronze scale clanking as silver gets weighed out to the precise fraction needed. Somewhere a goat expressing loud displeasure at being examined by a potential buyer. Underneath it all sits the smell of the place. Fish and dust and animal, and the sharp green scent of fresh herbs bundled and stacked for sale, occasionally interrupted by a genuinely wonderful waft of something being grilled nearby, meant purely to lure hungry shoppers a few steps off their intended path. The haggling itself follows an unspoken but universally understood choreography. The merchant names a price he knows is too high. You express visible disappointment, perhaps gesture at the quality of a competitor's onions 2 stalls over. He counters, wounded, insisting his goods are simply superior and worth every shekel of silver. You threaten, gently, to walk away. He relents slightly, and you both eventually land somewhere in the vague middle that both parties silently agreed on roughly 4 exchanges ago, but needed the performance to properly get there. Ever haggled with a market vendor on vacation, secretly enjoying it far more than you'd ever admit to your travel companions? Congratulations, you've just discovered one of humanity's oldest and most consistent forms of entertainment. Payment itself requires its own small ritual, since coinage doesn't exist yet, and silver gets weighed out in careful fractions using a portable scale the merchant keeps close at hand, checked and double-checked, because shaving silver, quite literally, was a documented problem this economy had to guard against. You walk away eventually with your onions, your dates, and your dignity mostly intact. Slightly poorer, thoroughly haggled, and completely unaware that 4,000 years later, people would still be doing this exact same dance over a rug in a souk somewhere, insisting they got the better end of the deal the entire way home. Let's talk about writing, because in Babylon, literacy isn't something you casually pick up. It is a genuine profession, taught at a scribal school called the Eduba, where boys, mostly from comfortable families, spend years pressing a reed stylus into wet clay to master hundreds of wedge-shaped cuneiform signs. The work is repetitive, the discipline is strict, and a tablet full of mistakes can earn a student a genuinely unpleasant conversation with his teacher. But a trained scribe can draft contracts, record harvests, write letters,
and keep the entire bureaucratic machinery of the city moving, which makes him quietly one of the more powerful people in Babylon. It's less romantic than it sounds, and considerably harder on the wrist, but someone has to keep an empire's paperwork in order. Picture a small mud-brick room, cool and dim compared to the street outside, lined with rows of students seated cross-legged, each with a lump of fresh river clay in his lap and a reed stylus cut to a precise wedge-shaped point. The teacher, a senior scribe, with the weary patience of someone who has corrected this exact same mistake several thousand times, walks the rows, checking each tablet in turn. Progress is slow and repetitive by design. Students copying the same signs over and over, then whole word lists, then eventually short passages of literature or law, building fluency the same tedious way anyone builds fluency in anything, one imperfect attempt after another. The clay itself has a distinct cool, slightly gritty feel against the fingers, damp enough to take an impression, but firm enough to hold its shape once the stylus presses in. Get the angle wrong and the wedge comes out smudged or shallow, illegible to anyone trying to read it later, which, in a profession built entirely around precise record-keeping, is considerably more than a minor cosmetic problem. Students who make careless errors, by several surviving accounts from actual Babylonian schoolboys, faced real physical discipline, a detail that tends to make modern complaints about strict teachers feel somewhat more manageable by comparison. Ever sat through years of a subject you were fairly sure you'd never actually use, memorizing formulas or vocabulary lists purely because the test demanded it? The Eduba ran on that exact energy, except the stakes were considerably higher, since a poorly trained scribe couldn't simply forget the material after final exams. He'd be drafting real contracts and recording real debts for the rest of his working life, with real consequences for every wedge pressed slightly wrong. Those who make it through years of this training, mastering not just basic cuneiform, but the specialized vocabulary of law, mathematics, or religious ritual, emerge into genuinely valuable careers. A skilled scribe might work for a temple, a merchant house, or the palace itself, drafting the marriage contracts, land sales, and court rulings that keep Babylonian society functioning with something resembling order. It's tedious work by any modern standard, hunched over damp clay for hours at a stretch, but it's also one of the only paths in this world that lets an ordinary, literate person quietly hold real influence over the lives of people considerably wealthier and more powerful than he'll ever personally be. It's time to talk about the law, because whatever stretch of Babylon's long history you find yourself in, this city runs on rules detailed enough that even the punishments come itemized. The legal tradition traces back centuries to King Hammurabi, whose sweeping code, covering everything from shoddy construction to unpaid debts to disputes between neighbors, still shapes how judges rule here, even though his original carved stone pillar was hauled off by conquerors generations ago, and now sits in a foreign city far from this one. Disputes get settled before local judges, witnesses are taken seriously, and a sealed written contract is treated as something close to sacred. It's organized, it's thorough, and by any modern measure, it is not remotely gentle. Step into a courtyard where a local dispute is being heard, and you'll notice immediately how procedural the whole thing feels. Judges sit and listen to both sides present their case. Witnesses are called forward to swear to what they saw, and written contracts, when they exist, are treated as close to unimpeachable evidence, since a properly sealed clay tablet doesn't change its story the way a human witness occasionally does under pressure. There's a genuine seriousness to the proceeding, none of the improvised chaos you might expect from a society this old. And honestly, it wouldn't feel entirely out of place transplanted into a modern small claims courtroom, minus the fluorescent lighting. The famous penalties associated with Hammurabi's code, the eye for an eye principle that survived in cultural memory for millennia, do genuinely appear here, though the punishment often depends heavily on the social status of everyone involved, a detail modern retellings tend to conveniently smooth over. A case involving property damage, a botched building project, or an unpaid debt is just as likely to end in a court as a violent dispute, and the code covers all of it in remarkable, almost obsessive detail, right down to the liability of a builder whose house collapses and kills the owner inside it. Ever read the absurdly long terms and conditions before installing an app, half aware that some clause in there could genuinely matter someday, but skimming past it anyway because who has the time? Babylonian contracts ran on the opposite philosophy entirely. Every clause got read, argued over, and taken with total seriousness, because a sealed clay tablet was, quite literally, your entire legal recourse if a business deal went wrong. And there was no polite customer service line to call when it did. Witnesses matter enormously in this system, and a dispute without them is a genuinely weak position to argue from, which explains why so many everyday transactions, even relatively minor ones, get formalized with a scribe and a handful of neighbors standing by specifically to remember the details later if needed. You watch the case before you resolve with a ruling that both parties accept, grudgingly, and a scribe nearby is already pressing the outcome into a fresh tablet, ensuring that whatever happened here today will still be legally, precisely on record, long after everyone involved has been dead for centuries, which is either deeply reassuring or mildly terrifying, depending entirely on which side of the dispute you happen to be standing on. Let's talk about money, because Babylon runs on silver, weighed out in careful little portions rather than counted in convenient coins, since actual coinage hasn't been invented yet. A merchant might carry a small scale everywhere, snipping off bits of silver to the precise weight a transaction demands. But the real innovation isn't the silver itself, it's what people do with it. Because Babylonian temples and merchant houses have already worked out how to lend money at interest, track it meticulously on clay tablets, and pursue anyone who falls behind. It is, in a very real sense, the birthplace of banking, complete with contracts, receipts, and the same quiet dread of compounding interest that keeps people awake in your own time. You watch a merchant conduct a transaction nearby, and the process is more involved than simply handing over a coin ever could be. A small bronze scale comes out, tiny weights are set on one side, and a length of raw silver, sometimes coiled, sometimes in irregular chunks, gets carefully clipped down until the balance settles perfectly level. It's slow, it's precise, and it demands a level of mutual trust between buyer and seller that a stamped, standardized coin would eventually make unnecessary. Though that particular innovation is still centuries away from anyone's mind. Loans here are entirely ordinary, whether from a temple, a wealthy merchant, or a professional moneylender, and the interest rates involved are recorded with startling precision on clay tablets, specifying the amount borrowed, the rate charged, typically calculated in grain or silver, and the repayment terms both parties agreed to. Default carries real consequences, and a tablet recording an unpaid debt functions much like a modern promissory note, chased down by the lender with the same persistence your own era reserves for a collections agency, minus the robocalls, plus the occasional visit from someone considerably more intimidating than a robocall. Ever opened a banking app and stared blankly at an interest rate calculation, vaguely aware that math is happening somewhere, in your favour or against it, without fully understanding either? Babylonian scribes were doing genuinely sophisticated interest calculations on wet clay millennia before anyone invented compound interest tables, working out repayment schedules with a level of mathematical fluency that would make your average interest rate app feel like it's coasting on borrowed homework. Temples, in particular, function as something close to an early banking institution, storing surplus grain and silver, lending it out to farmers and merchants who need capital, and collecting the proceeds with an efficiency that would be impressive in any century. A farmer facing a bad season might borrow grain against next year's harvest. The terms carefully specified and witnessed. The tablet stored for safekeeping until the debt is settled. It's a system built on trust, documentation, and the quiet understanding that everyone involved intends to eventually pay what they owe. A system that mostly works remarkably well, right up until the harvest fails and the entire arrangement turns considerably less theoretical for the family on the losing end of it. This next part deserves a gentler touch, because falling into debt in Babylon carries consequences that were genuinely severe. Under the law, someone unable to repay what they owed could be required to give over their own labour, or even a family member, into a period of servitude to settle the account, typically limited to a few years by custom and statute. It was framed as a way of making a debt whole, rather than punishing a person outright, with real limits meant to prevent permanent bondage. But for the families living through it, the fear was constant and the shame was real. We'll sit with this one honestly, rather than joke through it, because behind every clay tablet recording a loan was a household whose entire future rested on whether the harvest came in on time. Understand first what this arrangement actually meant for the people living inside it. A bad flood, a failed crop, an unexpected illness could push an otherwise stable household into debt within a single season. And once that debt existed, it didn't simply disappear because circumstances were difficult. The law provided some real protection, capping the length of this kind of servitude and offering avenues for eventual release. A genuine attempt at limiting the harm, even within a system that still, by any modern measure, allowed one person's labour or a family member's freedom to be handed over as collateral. For the person sent to work off a family's debt, often a wife or child rather than the household head himself, the daily reality meant labour in someone else's home or fields, away from your own family, for a fixed but still meaningful stretch of years. The record of it existed permanently, pressed into clay and stored, a documented fact of your household's history that neighbours could know about, that future marriage negotiations might quietly factor in, that carried a real social weight beyond the practical hardship itself. It's worth noting, too, that this wasn't a system without limits or without conscience entirely. The legal traditions specifically bounded how long this servitude could last, a real acknowledgement that permanent bondage over an unpaid debt crossed a line even this legal code wasn't willing to formally cross. Whether that limit was always honoured in practice is harder to know with certainty, but the fact that it existed at all tells you something about how seriously Babylonian law tried to balance a creditor's right to be repaid against a basic recognition that a person's entire future shouldn't be permanently forfeited over a bad harvest. There's no clever comparison to modern life that quite fits here. No dry punchline waiting at the end of this one. What there is instead is a simple, sobering truth worth carrying forward. Behind every carefully weighed measure of silver, every interest rate calculated with such precise scribal skill, sat real families for whom a single failed season could mean years of separation and labour under someone else's roof. History remembers the contracts. It's worth remembering, too, the households who lived on the difficult side of them. Let's follow the water, because nothing in Babylon exists without the Euphrates and the intricate lattice of canals branching off from it. The river doesn't just supply drinking water and irrigation, it functions as the city's main highway, carrying reed boats and small round vessels called guffers that spin gently as they drift, looking less like boats and more like giant floating baskets, which, in fairness, is essentially what they are.
Farmers upstream depend on the canal system, with an intensity bordering on the religious, since Babylon's entire food supply rests on water arriving exactly where it should, exactly when it should. Get the irrigation wrong for a season, and the consequences ripple through the whole city. Get it right, and the desert quietly feeds an empire. Stand at the riverbank for a moment and watch the traffic moving across the water, because it's genuinely one of the strangest sights this city has to offer. The gufars, round hulls woven from reeds and coated with bitumen to keep them watertight, drift downstream with a peculiar lazy spin, the boatman working a single oar just to keep the thing roughly pointed where he wants it to go, which is a bold word for what actually happens, since the current mostly does what it likes, regardless of anyone's intentions. Larger cargo, grain, timber, stone, hauled down from distant quarries, moves on sturdier rafts, sometimes floated on inflated animal skins, lashed together beneath the platform, an arrangement that looks precarious and functions by all accounts remarkably well. The canals themselves are an entirely separate marvel, a carefully engineered network of channels diverting river water out toward the fields, controlled by wooden or stone sluice gates that farmers and officials monitor with genuine anxiety. Too little water, and the crops fail. Too much,
and the fields flood. Silt builds up wrong, and next season's harvest suffers just the same. Managing this balance requires constant coordination. Disputes over water rights show up regularly in the legal record, and an official whose job involves canal maintenance holds a position of real, unglamorous importance in keeping the entire city fed. Ever sat in traffic behind someone driving so cautiously it felt almost personal, and wondered how anyone gets anywhere in this town? The Gufar experience is the ancient equivalent, minus the road rage, plus the very real possibility of drifting gently into a reed bank because the current had other plans for your afternoon. Navigation here isn't precise, so much as generally cooperative with the river's mood that day. The smell of the water carries its own particular character, muddy and mineral, mixed with the green scent of reeds growing thick along the banks, and the occasional whiff of bitumen sealing on a boat hull nearby. Fishermen work the shallows with nets and simple traps, hauling in the catch that will end up grilled over someone's dinner fire by evening. It's a working river in every sense, part highway, part farmland's lifeline, part food source, doing the job of a dozen separate modern infrastructures at once, and doing it, more often than not, with nothing more sophisticated than a woven reed hull, a length of rope, and a boatman who has clearly made peace with letting the current decide most of the details. Let's talk about the tallest, strangest, most argued over building in the entire city, the great stepped ziggurat known as Etemenanki, dedicated to the god Marduk. It rises in tiered mud brick terraces toward a small shrine at its summit, visible from well outside the city walls, dominating the skyline the way nothing else in Babylon quite manages. Priests climb it for rituals meant to draw the god closer to the heavens, while ordinary Babylonians simply live in its enormous shadow day after day. The way you might live near a mountain you've stopped consciously noticing. Centuries later, storytellers would spin its scale into the legend of a tower that reached too high toward heaven and was struck down for the attempt. Standing at its base tonight, you don't need the legend. The building alone does the job of making you feel appropriately small. Walk closer, and the scale of the thing becomes almost uncomfortable to properly take in. Each tier rises steeply above the last, built from mud brick fired hard enough to survive the elements, bound together with bitumen that gives the whole lower structure a faint tarry smell if you get close enough on a particularly hot afternoon. A long ramp or staircase, depending on which side you approach from, climbs along the face of the structure, and priests and temple attendants move up and down it as part of their daily duties, a commute that would put the most ambitious modern stair-climbing workout to shame. At the summit sits a small shrine, considerably less grand in physical size than the tower supporting it, reserved for priests conducting rituals meant to honor Marduk directly. Close as physically possible to the heavens, the ziggurat is straining upward to reach. Ordinary Babylonians don't climb it themselves. Their relationship with the building is one of proximity rather than direct access, living beneath its shadow, orienting their sense of the city's geography around it, feeling its presence the way you might feel the presence of a cathedral bell tower without ever personally climbing into the belfry. Ever driven past the same enormous landmark every single day of your commute? A bridge, a stadium, a skyline-dominating building, until you genuinely stopped seeing it at all. Babylonians developed exactly that same numbness toward Etemenanke, treating the single most extraordinary structure most of them will ever personally witness as simply, unremarkably, the backdrop to an ordinary Tuesday. The tower's later fame, ironically, has almost nothing to do with what it actually was, and everything to do with a story told generations after this particular structure stood. A tale of a proud attempt to build toward the heavens that ends in confusion and collapse, eventually attached to this exact skyline by writers who never saw it standing. The real building was, more simply, a serious piece of religious architecture, a physical expression of a city's devotion to its patron god, built and rebuilt over centuries as earlier structures crumbled and were replaced. Standing beneath it now, dwarfed by tier after mudbrick tier, climbing into a sky the colour of hammered bronze, you don't need any legend layered on top. The tower has already, entirely on its own, made its point. Now for the single most famous thing about Babylon that may not have happened here at all. The hanging gardens. Tiered terraces supposedly dripping with imported trees and lush greenery, watered by some ingenious system hauling river water level by level, are described in glowing detail by writers who arrived centuries later and, as far as modern archaeology can tell, never once set foot in the city themselves. Nebuchadnezzar's own building records, remarkably thorough on nearly everything else he constructed, mention no such garden. Some historians now suspect the legend actually describes a garden built in the rival city of Nineveh, quietly relocated by later storytellers to a more famous address. Whether the garden stood exactly here, or somewhere else entirely, one thing is certain. Nobody in the ancient world could resist a good exaggeration, and Babylon collected more than its fair share of them. It's worth sitting with just how strange this particular mystery actually is, because Babylon's builders were not shy about documenting their own achievements. Inscriptions boast in exhaustive detail about walls, temples, and canals. Nebuchadnezzar's scribes recording his projects with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely wanted history to remember exactly how much he'd accomplished. And yet the single structure that would eventually make this city most famous to the outside world appears nowhere in that record. An absence that has left archaeologists scratching their heads for well over a century now. The classical descriptions that do exist, written by Greek authors working from second-hand accounts generations after the fact, describe an elaborate system of terraced planting beds, watered by some kind of mechanical device, hauling river water up level by level, so that trees and greenery could flourish high above the surrounding city. It's a genuinely impressive engineering feat, if it existed as described, And it's exactly the sort of story that travels well, growing slightly more magnificent with each retelling, the ancient equivalent of a fish story that keeps getting a little bigger every time someone tells it at the tavern. The more compelling modern theory, championed by researchers who've dug carefully through the available inscriptions, points instead toward the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who built an elaborate palace garden in Nineveh, complete with irrigation systems and imported plants, decades before Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon reached its own famous peak. Somewhere in the retelling, across centuries and translations, the garden's address seems to have quietly shifted to the more famous city down the road, the ancient equivalent of a rumour attaching itself to the biggest name in the room, rather than the actual source. Ever heard a story so many times, attributed to so many slightly different sources, that you genuinely couldn't say any more where it actually started? That's more or less the situation archaeologists find themselves untangling here, sorting through centuries of second-hand retelling to figure out which magnificent garden actually belonged to which magnificent city. Whether you're technically standing in the shadow of the real gardens tonight, or simply in the shadow of a very good story that Babylon happened to inherit, the lesson holds either way. Some legends outlive the facts entirely, and Babylon, more than almost anywhere else in the ancient world, seems to have had a genuine talent for collecting them. Let's walk toward the Ishtar Gate and try not to gawk too obviously, because this is an entrance built specifically to make visitors feel small. Deep blue glazed brick covers the towering structure, decorated with rows of golden lions, bulls, and dragons marching in careful procession across its surface. It marks the start of the processional way, a long ceremonial avenue used during religious festivals, where statues of the gods are carried through the city amid crowds, incense, and music. Merchants, farmers, and nobles alike pause whatever they're doing when the procession passes, because this is Babylon's quiet, unmistakable way of reminding everyone exactly whose city this really is. Standing before it properly for the first time, the colour hits you before anything else does. A rich, saturated blue, unlike anything you'd expect brick to naturally produce, achieved through a glazing technique that took real technical mastery to perfect, and even more effort to maintain across an entire monumental structure. The animals marching across its surface, lions associated with the goddess Ishtar herself, bulls linked to the storm god Adad, the strange scaled dragon creatures called Mushushu tied to Marduk, are rendered in raised relief, catching the light differently depending on the hour, gleaming gold against that deep blue in a way that makes the whole gate look less like a wall and more like a genuinely alive piece of art. Pass beneath it and you're standing at the start of the processional way, a broad paved avenue lined with more of the same glazed brickwork, lions marching along either side as though escorting you personally toward the temple district. During major festivals, this street becomes the stage for the city's most important religious theatre. Statues of the gods carried in careful procession, incense thick enough to sting your eyes slightly. Musicians keeping pace alongside with drums and lyres. Crowds pressing in from every side to watch something they consider genuinely, deeply significant unfold in front of them. Ever attended a massive parade back home, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, straining to see over the person in front of you, half thrilled and half just trying not to get an elbow to the ribs? The processional way runs on that exact energy, except the float you're craning your neck to see is a solid gold statue of a god being carried by priests, and getting a good vantage point apparently mattered enough that people staked out spots along the route well before the procession actually started. The gate and the avenue together function as a kind of permanent civic announcement, built specifically to overwhelm anyone passing through, whether they're a foreign dignitary arriving for the first time or simply a local farmer who's walked beneath it 1,000 times before. It's propaganda rendered in glazed brick and gold leaf, an unmistakable statement that this city and the king who built it intend to be remembered. Standing beneath those painted lions now, dwarfed by scale and colour and sheer deliberate spectacle, it's hard to argue the message didn't land exactly as intended. Let's step inside the temple complex, because in Babylon, the priesthood is not simply a religious calling, it is one of the most powerful institutions in the entire economy. Temples own land, manage vast storehouses of grain, employ armies of workers, and lend silver right alongside the merchant houses. Priests carry out daily rituals meant to keep the gods properly fed, quite literally, setting meals before divine statues morning and evening, as though the gods themselves might otherwise go hungry. Behind the incense and ceremony sits an operation closer to a well-run enterprise than a quiet house of worship. One that keeps meticulous records and touches nearly every part of daily Babylonian life, whether you ever set foot inside or not. Walk through the temple gates, and the first thing you notice is scale. Courtyards opening onto storerooms opening onto workshops, the entire complex functioning less like a single sacred building and more like a small, self-contained town with its own economy. Scribes sit tallying grain shipments. Craftsmen work on ritual objects destined for the inner sanctuary. Herders bring livestock in for sacrifice or for the temple's own considerable flocks. It's genuinely difficult, standing in the middle of it, to separate where the religious function ends and the economic enterprise begins. Mostly because in Babylon, those two things were never really considered separate at all. The daily feeding ritual for the god statue happens with real ceremony. A meal prepared and presented with the same care you'd give an honoured guest. Incense burning nearby, priests performing the presentation according to exact traditional steps that have been repeated, essentially unchanged, for generations. The statue doesn't eat, of course, but the offering itself is treated with total seriousness, and the food, once the ritual concludes, doesn't go to waste, redistributed instead among temple staff, a practical arrangement that turns religious devotion into something resembling a very elaborate, very reverent staff cafeteria. Ever worked somewhere with such a sprawling org chart that you genuinely couldn't say what half the departments actually did day to day? A major Babylonian temple ran on that exact scale of complexity. Priests handling ritual, scribes handling records, overseers managing land and labour, all operating under a single religious institution that also happened to double as a bank, a granary, and one of the city's largest employers. Priestesses hold genuine standing within this system as well, some managing significant property and business affairs in their own right, their positions carrying real social respect independent of any husband or father's status. The temple's economic reach extends well beyond its own walls too, lending grain to farmers facing a difficult season, financing trade expeditions, holding land that ordinary tenant farmers work in exchange for a share of the harvest. Walking back out through the temple gates into the ordinary bustle of the street, you carry with you a slightly recalibrated understanding of what religion actually meant here. Less a separate sphere of quiet devotion, and considerably more the engine quietly running underneath a large share of the city's entire economic life. Let's look up, because Babylonian priests and scholars have spent generations tracking the night sky with a patience bordering on obsession, and it has paid off in ways that still echo into your own life. They chart the movements of the planets with real mathematical precision, record eclipses across long stretches of time, and divide the sky into sections that would eventually, centuries after this particular night, evolve into the zodiac you still see printed in newspaper horoscopes. This isn't idle stargazing. Babylonian astronomers keep exhaustive written records, predicting celestial events with an accuracy that would impress observers for 1,000 years afterward. To them, the stars aren't just beautiful. They're a genuine, working system. One more piece of a universe they intend to understand, measure, and use to their advantage. Climb up to a rooftop after dark, and it's easy to understand why this civilization became so fixated on the sky in the first place. Away from the glow of modern lighting, the stars here spread out with an intensity that feels almost aggressive, dense and layered and impossible to ignore. The kind of sky that practically demands someone start taking notes. Somewhere nearby, a temple astronomer is doing precisely that, seated with a clay tablet, tracking the position of a particular planet against the backdrop of fixed stars, comparing tonight's reading against decades of previous nights recorded by scholars who came before him. The scale of the record-keeping is genuinely staggering when you consider it properly. Generations of careful, nightly observation, passed down and built upon, allow these astronomers to predict eclipses with real accuracy, to track the irregular movements of the planets against a backdrop that mostly repeats with reassuring regularity, and to slowly divide the sky's path along the sun's yearly route into the 12 familiar segments that would eventually travel, largely intact, into the horoscope column of a newspaper you might have skimmed over coffee last week. Ever glanced at your horoscope, half believing it, mostly just curious what the universe supposedly has planned for your Tuesday? You're indirectly consulting the work product of Babylonian scholars who spent literal centuries meticulously logging the sky, one clear night at a time, purely so that thousands of years later someone could read, in a slightly different context, that Mercury being in retrograde explains why their group chat is being unusually dramatic this week.
What separates this work from mere superstition is the sheer discipline behind it. Mathematical models developed to predict planetary positions. Careful cross-referencing of eclipse records stretching back generations. A genuine scholarly tradition that later Greek astronomers would draw on directly, crediting Babylonian data as a foundation for their own work. It's a rare case where an ancient practice, born partly from religious and omen-based motivations, quietly produces something that holds up as legitimate, rigorous observational science by any modern measure. Looking up at that same dense, star-choked sky tonight, it's genuinely humbling to realize you're seeing, more or less, the exact same view that convinced an entire civilization the heavens were worth watching this closely in the first place. Let's talk about the other side of Babylonian prediction, the side involving considerably more sheep. Diviners here practice a serious, highly technical craft, examining the liver and entrails of sacrificed animals for signs about the future, cross-referencing what they find against detailed reference texts describing exactly what an unusual lobe or a strange mark is supposed to mean. Kings consult diviners before battles. Merchants consult them before long journeys. It is treated with the same gravity your own era reserves for a weather forecast or a market report, except the instrument here is considerably more organic. To a modern visitor, it might look like superstition dressed up as science. To the Babylonians, it simply is science, dressed exactly the way science was supposed to look. Watch a diviner at work, and the process is considerably more methodical than you might expect from something involving a freshly sacrificed sheep. The animal's liver is removed carefully, examined feature by feature, the size and shape of specific lobes, the presence of any unusual marks or discolorations, each detail cross-referenced against extensive written omen texts that catalogue, in exhaustive detail, what a particular configuration has historically been understood to predict. It's less a mystical flash of insight and more a methodical consultation of an enormous, painstakingly assembled reference library, not unlike a doctor cross-checking symptoms against a diagnostic manual. The smell in the room is exactly what you'd expect. Warm, faintly metallic, thick with the particular scent of fresh organ meat that no amount of incense burning nearby quite manages to fully mask. The diviner's hands work with practiced, unhurried precision, and an assistant nearby may be reading aloud from the relevant reference tablet, checking the physical liver in front of them against the written descriptions of favourable and unfavourable signs recorded generations earlier by scholars who built this entire system one careful observation at a time. Ever refreshed a weather app obsessively before a major outdoor event, treating a 70% chance of rain as a genuinely personal insult from the universe? Babylonian kings did something remarkably similar before major decisions, except instead of checking a 5-day forecast, they were checking whether a sheep's liver approved of the military campaign they were about to launch. The stakes, admittedly, were somewhat higher, and the sheep, one assumes, had considerably less say in the matter than your weather app does in your picnic plans. This practice, called extispicy in its formal aspects, sits alongside astronomical observation as one of the two major branches of Babylonian divination, and both share the same underlying philosophy, that the world contains genuine, decipherable signs about what's coming,
provided you've built up enough careful, systematic knowledge to read them correctly. It's a worldview considerably less separated from what your own era calls science than it might first appear, built on record-keeping, pattern recognition, and the confident, if occasionally misplaced, belief that with sufficiently rigorous observation, the future becomes at least a little less unknowable. Whether you personally trust a sheep's liver over a satellite forecast is entirely your business, but you have to admit at minimum that both systems share a genuinely touching faith in humanity's ability to figure things out. Let's talk about marriage, because in Babylon, a wedding is as much a legal transaction as it is a romantic milestone. Marriages are arranged by families and formalized through written contracts, spelling out the dowry a bride brings into the household and the obligations each side owes the other. All carefully recorded on clay in case of future disputes. Love, where it exists, is treated as a pleasant bonus rather than the whole point. The household that results functions as a working economic unit as much as an emotional one, with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and property rights that a Babylonian judge could, and occasionally did, get called in to untangle. It is less a fairy tale and more a carefully worded partnership that also happens to include children. Sit in on the negotiation between two families arranging a marriage, and the atmosphere feels considerably closer to a business meeting than a romantic occasion. Fathers, or in some cases, the bride and groom's wider families, discuss the dowry the bride will bring, property, silver, household goods, sometimes livestock, all itemized and agreed upon before anyone starts discussing flowers or feasting arrangements. The groom's family, for their part, may agree to a bridal gift of their own, and the entire arrangement gets written down, witnessed, and sealed, because verbal promises, however sincerely meant, don't hold up especially well in front of a judge a decade later, when memories have conveniently blurred. The contract itself covers considerably more ground than modern prenuptial agreements typically bother with, specifying what happens to the dowry if the marriage ends in divorce, what a wife retains rights to versus what reverts to her birth family, and occasionally even outlining specific behavioral expectations for both parties. Divorce itself is possible under Babylonian law, and while the process favors husbands more often than not, a wife under certain documented circumstances could genuinely initiate one herself, a detail that surprises people who assume ancient legal systems offered women no real agency whatsoever. Ever sat through a friend's wedding where the paperwork, the seating chart negotiations, and the logistics genuinely seemed to eclipse whatever romantic sentiment started the whole thing in the first place? Babylon would have found that entirely unremarkable. A wedding here is, first and foremost, the formal joining of two households' resources and obligations, a partnership built for stability and mutual benefit, with whatever affection develops between the couple treated as a genuinely welcome but strictly secondary outcome. Once married, the household functions as its own small economic engine, the wife typically managing domestic affairs and potentially running a trade or business of her own, the husband handling outside dealings, land, contracts, whatever trade or craft supports the family. Children, when they arrive, represent both an emotional addition and a practical one. Future labour, future inheritance, future support for aging parents. It's an arrangement built with real, unromantic clarity about what a household actually needs to function and endure. And if that sounds a little unsentimental compared to your own era's wedding vows, it's worth remembering that this particular system, imperfect as it was, kept Babylonian households running smoothly enough to last several thousand years, which is more than most modern relationship advice can confidently promise. This next stretch deserves honesty rather than jokes, because women's lives in Babylon were shaped by real legal protections alongside real, significant limits. Babylonian law granted women certain rights unusual for the ancient world, including the ability to own property, engage in trade, and, under certain circumstances, initiate divorce. Some women ran businesses, managed estates, or served as priestesses with genuine standing and independence. At the same time, a woman's life was still largely governed by the decisions of the men in her household, her father, her husband, and the room available to her varied enormously by class and circumstance. Both things were true at once: real agency and real constraint. And an honest look at ancient Babylon has to hold both without smoothing either one away. Consider first what the law actually allowed, because it's more generous in certain respects than people often assume about the ancient world. A woman could own property in her own name, separate from her husband's holdings, could enter into contracts, could run a business, brew and sell beer, manage a trade, and under documented circumstances could bring a case for divorce before a judge and be granted one. Priestesses, particularly those attached to major temples, held positions of genuine religious and economic authority, managing property and personnel with an independence that many women in later, supposedly more advanced eras would not enjoy for a very long time afterward. And yet, none of this erased the deeper structural reality shaping most women's daily lives. Marriages were arranged by fathers, dowries negotiated without the bride's direct input in most cases, and a woman's standing within her household depended heavily on her husband's decisions, his wealth, his temperament, his willingness to honor the terms both families had agreed to. Legal protection existed on the tablet. Whether it was consistently, fairly applied in an actual household dispute likely depended, as it so often does across history, on the particular people involved and the particular power they each held going in. Class mattered enormously here, too. A woman from a wealthy merchant family or a temple priestess occupied a meaningfully different world than a farmer's wife or a servant. The practical freedoms and protections available to her shifting considerably depending on where her family sat within Babylonian society. There's no single tidy story that captures the full range of what it meant to be a woman in this city. Only a genuinely wide spectrum running from real independence and authority to real, constant vulnerability, sometimes within the very same household, across different stages of a single life. We won't force a punchline onto this one. because it doesn't need one and doesn't deserve one. What's worth carrying forward instead is simply the fuller picture. A legal system more progressive in certain narrow respects than its reputation suggests, sitting alongside a deeply patriarchal social structure that shaped most women's actual daily experience, regardless of what the tablet in the temple archive technically permitted. Both were real, both mattered, and both deserve to be remembered honestly, rather than flattened into either a rosy exception or a simple tale of universal oppression. By midday, Babylon essentially stops. The sun climbs high enough that the packed dirt streets shimmer. The mud brick walls radiate heat back at you like a personal insult. And anyone with any sense retreats indoors or into whatever shade can be found. Thick mud brick walls, deliberately built dense, actually keep interiors surprisingly cool, soaking up the worst of the heat through the day and slowly releasing it after dark. Business quiets down. Conversation moves into doorways and courtyards instead of open sun. It is, in essence, the ancient ancestor of the siesta, a city-wide agreement that certain hours of the day are simply not meant for productivity, no matter how urgent your errand felt an hour earlier. Step inside a Babylonian home during these hours, and the temperature difference is genuinely striking. The thick clay walls holding on to the relative cool of the previous night far longer than you'd expect, creating a dim, tolerable refuge from a street outside that has, by this point, become close to unbearable. The household gathers in the central courtyard, shaded by whatever awning or overhang the architecture provides, and the pace of everything, conversation, work, even simple movement, slows into something close to deliberate stillness. You find yourself doing very little, and that turns out to be entirely by design. A woven mat in the shade, perhaps a light meal of bread and dates, conversation kept quiet and unhurried, because expending real energy during these particular hours risks actual heat stroke rather than mere discomfort. Even the market, so raucous and chaotic just a few hours earlier, thins out considerably, merchants retreating behind whatever shade their stall provides, transactions slowing to whatever's genuinely necessary rather than anything resembling enthusiastic commerce. Ever visited a country where every shop mysteriously closes for 2 or 3 hours right in the middle of the afternoon and found yourself standing outside a locked door, mildly outraged, before realizing everyone else had simply gone home for a nap and a proper meal? Babylon runs on that exact same wisdom, several thousand years before any modern tourist stood confused outside a shuttered pharmacy in the Mediterranean heat, wondering why an entire nation seemed to have simply given up on retail for the afternoon. By late afternoon, as the sun finally begins its slow descent and the worst of the heat starts, gradually, to loosen its grip, the city begins stirring back to life. Merchants reopen their stalls. Foot traffic returns to the streets. Conversations move back out of shaded doorways into the open air, and the whole rhythm of Babylonian daily life picks back up right where it paused hours earlier, as though the entire population had simply agreed, without ever needing to discuss it explicitly, that some parts of the day belong to work, and some parts belong, quite reasonably, to simply enduring the sun until it's willing to ease off a little. It's a rhythm built entirely around respecting a climate that offers no other real option. And honestly, it's hard to argue with a system that's kept an entire civilization functioning comfortably for this many centuries running. Let's talk about getting sick in Babylon, which involves a treatment plan blending careful herbal remedies with genuine incantations, and nobody here sees any contradiction in that combination. Physicians keep detailed medical texts listing symptoms and corresponding treatments, a real, methodical body of knowledge built up over generations. But illness is also widely understood as the work of offended spirits or displeased gods, so a house call might include both a bitter herbal poultice and a ritual chant meant to drive out whatever divine irritation started the problem in the first place. It's less a contradiction than a covering of all available bases, treating the body and the unseen cause behind it in the very same visit, which, depending on how you look at it, is either wonderfully thorough or a very reasonable way of hedging your bets. Imagine yourself laid up with a fever, and the physician who arrives carries with him a genuinely methodical toolkit. He examines you, asks about your symptoms, consults his own memory or a written reference text cataloguing similar cases and their typical progression, since Babylonian medical scholars have compiled extensive diagnostic handbooks describing symptoms in careful, almost clinical detail, cross-referenced against likely causes and recommended treatments. It's a genuinely organised approach to diagnosis, methodical enough that a modern doctor, setting aside the specific remedies involved, would recognise the underlying professional instinct immediately. The remedies themselves draw heavily on plants, minerals and animal products. Poultices applied to a wound, herbal mixtures administered for internal complaints, remedies that modern pharmacological analysis has occasionally found to contain genuinely active, beneficial compounds, alongside plenty that almost certainly did very little beyond offering psychological comfort. Alongside the physical treatment, though, comes the second half of the house call, a ritual specialist, sometimes the same practitioner wearing a different professional hat, reciting incantations meant to identify and expel whatever spiritual affliction triggered the illness in the first place, since a fever this severe surely couldn't be purely physical in origin. Ever taken a course of antibiotics for an infection while also, quietly, drinking a suspicious amount of herbal tea and telling yourself it definitely helps, just in case? Babylonian medicine ran on that exact same instinct, treating the measurable and the immeasurable side by side, hedging every bet available, because when you're genuinely sick, certainty is a luxury nobody, in any century, actually has access to. The smell of the sick room carries its particular character too, bitter herbs steeping somewhere nearby, the faint smoke of incense burning as part of the accompanying ritual, and beneath it all, the simple, universal discomfort of being unwell in a climate this relentlessly hot. The physician departs eventually, leaving behind his herbal preparation and his careful instructions, confident he's addressed both the visible symptoms and the invisible cause behind them. Whether you recover because of the poultice, the incantation, both, or simply your own body doing what bodies eventually do, the Babylonian house call leaves you with the distinct, oddly comforting sense that absolutely nothing was left unaddressed, medically or spiritually, in the effort to get you back on your feet. As the heat finally breaks, it's time for a little entertainment, and Babylonians take their leisure just as seriously as their commerce. The royal game of a race-style board game played with dice and small coloured pieces, has already been popular for over 1,000 years by this point, and it shows no sign of falling out of fashion. Taverns fill with the evening crowd, serving beer, hosting games, and occasionally drawing the disapproving attention of local officials, since Babylonian law has quite a lot to say about tavern pricing and the conduct expected of the women who often run them. Between the board games, the gossip, and the beer, a Babylonian tavern in the evening looks, in its bones, remarkably like a neighbourhood bar anywhere else in history, minus the dartboard. Step into a tavern as the evening crowd starts settling in, and the atmosphere is immediately, warmly familiar, despite the 4,000 intervening years. Beer flows freely from large communal jars, reed straws distributed around the table, conversation rising in volume as the evening progresses, exactly the way it does in any bar, in any century, once people have had a drink or two and started genuinely relaxing. In one corner, two players hunch over a small wooden board inlaid with shell and coloured stone, the royal game of laid out between them, dice clattering as pieces race along the marked path toward the far end. A game of strategy and luck, in roughly equal measure, that's apparently been keeping people entertained since long before this particular evening. The rules involve racing your pieces along a track while trying to land on favourable squares and knock your opponent's pieces backward. And the dice, small pyramid-shaped pieces rather than the cubes you'd recognise, tumble across the table to a chorus of groans or triumphant laughter, depending on how the roll landed.
It's genuinely engaging to watch, the kind of game that draws a small crowd of onlookers offering unsolicited advice to both players, which, again, tracks remarkably closely with how board game night tends to go in any household you've ever personally witnessed. Ever gathered around a friend's kitchen table for game night, watching someone agonize dramatically over a single move, while everyone else offers loud, unhelpful commentary from the sidelines? The tavern crowd here operates on that exact same energy, minus the snack bowl, plus considerably more beer, and the stakes occasionally involving a genuinely wounded ego rather than simply bragging rights until next week. The taverns themselves, often run by women according to the surviving legal record, are subject to fairly detailed regulation, pricing rules meant to prevent overcharging, and specific legal consequences for tavern keepers who allow certain kinds of trouble to brew unchecked on their premises. It's a business with real civic scrutiny attached to it, treated with the same seriousness as any other trade a Babylonian scribe might be asked to draft a contract for. As the evening wears on and the beer jar empties, the conversation drifts, as it always does, toward gossip, complaints about the harvest, speculation about whether the king's latest building project will actually get finished on schedule, and the low, comfortable murmur of an ordinary evening winding down. 4,000 years before anyone thought to call it happy hour. It's time to eat properly, and dinner in Babylon, when a household can manage it, is a genuinely serious affair. Fish pulled fresh from the Euphrates gets grilled or stewed, often alongside onions, garlic and leeks that turn up in nearly every recipe this civilization has ever bothered to write down. Barley bread rounds out the meal, along with dates, dried fruit, and whatever cheese or meat the family's means allow. Wealthier households might stretch to roasted lamb or the spoils of a hunt, served with considerably more ceremony. It is a cuisine built almost entirely around what the river
and the irrigated fields provide. Proof that even 4,000 years ago, good cooking mostly just meant working honestly with whatever was actually on hand. Gather with the household around the evening meal, and the smell reaches you before anything else does. Fish grilling over an open flame, the sharp sweetness of onions and garlic softened down in a simmering stew. Warm barley bread, fresh enough that steam still curls off the top when it's broken open. The fish itself, likely caught that same afternoon from the river or one of its canals, has a clean, slightly muddy freshwater flavour, and it gets prepared simply, grilled directly over coals, or stewed with whatever vegetables and herbs the household has on hand, since elaborate sauces and seasonings are largely reserved for the tables of the genuinely wealthy. Barley forms the backbone of nearly everything here, ground into flour for bread, brewed into the beer that accompanies every meal, even used as a form of payment and measurement in contracts you'd have encountered earlier in the marketplace. Onions, garlic, and leeks appear constantly, recorded in surviving recipe tablets, with a frequency that suggests this civilization understood, quite correctly, that these three ingredients could carry an enormous amount of flavour in a cuisine that otherwise had relatively modest access to exotic spice. Ever noticed how nearly every genuinely comforting dish in your own life traces back to onions, garlic, and some form of starch, no matter which country's cuisine you're actually looking at? Babylon got there first, several millennia ahead of every modern comfort food blog, insisting that a proper stew starts with a well-cooked onion, a piece of advice that, credit where due, has apparently held up remarkably well across the entire span of human civilization.
Wealthier households round out the meal with considerably more ambition. Roasted lamb, seasoned with whatever imported spices the family's trade connections allow. Perhaps game brought back from a hunting expedition, served alongside dried fruit and richer breads that a poorer household simply couldn't stretch their budget to include. The actual surviving recipe tablets from this broader Mesopotamian tradition describe stews layered with real technique, specific cooking times, specific combinations of meat, vegetable, and seasoning that suggest genuine culinary pride rather than mere survival eating. As the meal winds down and the household lingers a little in the cooling evening air, it's genuinely striking how familiar the whole scene feels. A family gathered over good, simple food, made from whatever the land and river provided that particular season. Exactly the same quiet daily comfort that's anchored dinner tables in every century since. As the evening deepens, listen for the music, because Babylon takes its songs seriously. Lyres, harps, and reed pipes accompany temple ceremonies, royal feasts, and ordinary household gatherings alike, and skilled musicians hold genuine social standing here, not unlike a respected performer in your own time. Songs are composed for religious hymns, for royal praise, and for simple entertainment, passed along and performed at gatherings where food, drink, and music blur together into one long, warm evening. Sit at the edge of a courtyard on a night like this, and the music drifting over from somewhere nearby, layered under the murmur of conversation, feels remarkably, almost unsettlingly familiar, like a dinner party you could picture attending in absolutely any century. Follow the sound to its source, and you'll likely find a small gathering, perhaps a family celebration, or simply an evening of friends sharing beer and company, with a musician seated slightly apart,
working a lyre strung with gut strings across an ornately carved wooden frame, sometimes topped with a bull's head worked in gold or shell inlay if the household or occasion is grand enough to warrant it. The sound itself carries a warm, resonant quality, plucked notes rising and falling in melodic patterns that accompany a singer's voice or simply stand alone as the evening's background texture, not unlike the low instrumental hum you might play at a dinner party without anyone consciously focusing on it. Musicians here hold a genuinely respected professional position, trained from a young age, sometimes attached permanently to a temple or royal household, where their skill is treated as a valuable, cultivated asset rather than mere casual talent. Temple musicians perform as part of formal religious ceremony, their music considered an essential component of properly honouring the gods, while others make their living performing at private gatherings, weddings, and public celebrations, building reputations that spread by word of mouth, exactly the way a genuinely talented performer's reputation spreads in any century. Ever gone to a dinner party where someone's friend, entirely unprompted, ends up playing guitar in the corner for half the evening, and the whole gathering slowly reorients itself around whatever they're playing? Babylon ran on that exact same social gravity, except the instrument was a lyre. The setting was a mud-brick courtyard under a genuinely spectacular star-choked sky, and the guitarist in question had probably trained for this specific skill since early childhood, rather than picking it up casually one summer. The songs themselves cover considerable emotional and thematic range, hymns praising specific gods, songs commemorating royal victories and building projects, and simpler pieces meant purely for the pleasure of the gathering, love songs and drinking songs that would have been instantly, comfortably recognizable in tone, if not in language, to anyone attending a lively gathering in almost any culture since. As the evening winds down, the music softening, conversations slowing into the comfortable murmur of people who've eaten and drunk well, and are simply enjoying each other's company a little longer before the night finally, properly claims them. It's hard not to feel the deep, quiet continuity of it all. An evening built from music and food and warm company, differing from your own only in the specific instruments and the considerably better view of the stars. Let's end with the strangest and most important event on the entire Babylonian calendar, the Akitu festival, marking the new year with days of ritual and procession, and one deeply peculiar ceremony involving the king himself. At a certain point in the festivities, the high priest strips the king of his royal regalia, strikes him across the face, and drags him before the statue of Marduk, where the king must declare his innocence and his devotion to the god. If the tears that follow seem genuine, it is taken as a good omen for the year ahead. It sounds like an elaborate practical joke played on the most powerful man in the empire, and in a sense, it is exactly that. A yearly, ritualized reminder that even a king answers to something bigger than himself. Picture the scene properly, because it's genuinely one of the more remarkable spectacles this civilization has to offer. The festival stretches across nearly 2 weeks in the spring, filled with processions, ritual reenactments, and public celebration. The entire city swept up in the rhythm of it. The processional way you walked earlier, packed with crowds, watching the god statues carried past amid music and incense. But the ceremony involving the king stands apart from all of it, conducted privately within the temple, witnessed only by priests and select officials. A moment of genuine vulnerability, deliberately built into the calendar of a man who spends the other 350 days of the year being treated as something close to divine himself. The high priest removes the king's crown, his scepter, every symbol of royal authority, leaving him standing stripped of the very things that define his position, and then, remarkably, strikes him across the face, hard enough that a genuine reaction is expected. The king is led before Marduk's statue and required to declare that he has not neglected his city, that he has upheld his duties honestly across the past year, a kind of annual performance review conducted by a god rather than a board of directors, with considerably higher stakes attached to the outcome. Ever sat through an end-of-year performance review, genuinely nervous despite knowing you'd done fine? Because there's something about formal, ritualized accountability that gets under anyone's skin, regardless of how confident you actually feel. The Babylonian king experienced that exact same anxiety, amplified considerably, since his version involved an actual physical slap and a divine judgment on which the entire kingdom's fortune for the coming year was believed to depend. If the king's eyes water from the blow, it's read as a genuinely good sign, evidence that the god has accepted his humility and his account of faithful service, and the crown, scepter, and regalia are returned to him with real ceremony, the king re-emerging as ruler once more, refreshed and legitimized for another year. It's an extraordinary piece of political theatre dressed in religious clothing, a built-in reminder, deliberately staged once a year, that even the most powerful man in Babylon exists within a system considerably larger and older than his own reign, and that the city's continued good fortune depends on him remembering that fact, publicly, on his knees, whether he particularly enjoys the reminder or not. So there you have it, a city built from river mud and stubborn ambition, where beer was breakfast, where a sheep's liver could settle a king's war plans, and where paying the first price a merchant named you was practically a personal insult. You've haggled in the marketplace, sweated through the worst of the midday heat, watched a king get slapped across the face for the good of the harvest, and somehow made it to the other side of the evening with your dignity mostly intact and your reed straw finally, mercifully empty. It's easy to laugh at the sheer chaos of it all, the tangled streets, the theatrical bargaining, the peculiar comfort people took in reading a liver like a weather report. But underneath the humour sits something genuinely worth sitting with. Babylon endured for thousands of years, not because life there was easy, but because the people who built it, farmed its canals, raised its walls, wrote its laws, and sang its songs, were remarkably resourceful, remarkably resilient, and quietly determined to make sense of a world that gave them very few guarantees. They built the tallest towers they could manage, wrote down every debt and every deal so nothing would be forgotten, and found real joy anyway, in a lyre played at dusk, in dates shared around a fire, in a board game that some evenings mattered more than anything else in the world. So tonight, as you sink into your own quiet bed, with a working faucet down the hall and a thermostat quietly doing the one job an entire ancient city organized its whole day around, take a moment to be grateful. Grateful for cool water on demand, for a night's sleep that doesn't depend on a rooftop breeze, and for a civilization long gone that still, somehow, managed to leave the stars a little more familiar than we found them. Sleep well. Babylon is still standing, quietly, in the dark behind your eyes.